Okay, so in this part, we're going to focus on getting the UI up to spec and getting our tasks in order for the project itself. So real quick, I want to add some styling to the index of the project path here. So on the index template, in the projects folder, we'll create a bit of a different look. I'm kind of copying and pasting this in just to show you that it's a quick and easy win. But the idea is we're going to display the heading of projects. Within each project, it's going to be a grid. So through Tailwind, we're able to get the grid, CSS grid properties and do some customizations around it. Display the project title and the description. I am truncating the description to 200 characters or words. And that's going to allow us to just kind of have longer descriptions if we need to on the index action. So if I save this and go back to projects, we'll see this kind of look and feel. Now the show page is going to be a different story. I'm going to go ahead and grab the code for that just to save some time. And we're going to remove some of it just because I want to get to some of that organically. So we have the project description. We don't have this author attribute yet, so I'll leave this in and then we'll just kind of approach it when we get to it. So I'm going to move that for now, remove this for now, then this, and we'll leave the rest. So we'll get to that stuff I just removed. I want it to be kind of slow and steady so you understand what's going on if you're not clear. So at this point, this would error out. We don't have a project.author method at all, and that's something we're going to need to add just to kind of give ourselves some context of what's happening here. So in the project model, before I forget, I want to add this attribute. So in the project model, I want to actually add a method that's called author. Now this could be a helper. It's up to you if you want to just add it as a method. And the way it could work is just to be self, which represents this class. Project users, where user equals user. So this will make more sense in the future when we get that set up. But for now, I'm going to keep this ready to roll. And then I'm actually going to comment this out because we're going to get some errors until we actually hook up more of the logic behind the scenes. But that's going to set the stage coming up. So next, let's work on getting the task form rendering on the project show page. So if we go to this page, we'll just have this, and okay, there's a project, there's a description, pretty crappy one, and then a task section, but no form. So we probably need to add that. So let's go ahead and go to the project controller, and I want to go to the show action actually. And notice there's nothing on the show action. It's just, it's ready to roll. But the reason we don't need to do like project equals project.find params.id. Normally you would need to do this here. But the cool thing is this before action, it goes ahead and does it for you. So that's what's actually happening here if no one ever explained that to you. So for each of these actions, we're basically calling this method here and setting that instance variable so we have access to the project itself. So with that in mind, we don't even need to do anything, and show can just be a method already existing. And then in the show, what we do need is a task instance for the task class. So when we say task.new, we're able to render a new task form on the show controller now, our show view of the project's controller. So if we didn't have this, we wouldn't be able to do that. So now what we can do is render that task form over here. So we could say partial or render, and we'll say tasks, task, and then through a task, we can pass in that instance variable. Hopefully that makes sense. So we're rendering a partial, which is actually within the task folder. It's going to be this form, but we're passing in the instance of task literally, like from our controller. So this task represents what's coming from right here. So in essence, you could just do this in your template and be fine, but it's kind of nice to extract those things to the controller or model layer when you can. Our task form, we probably need to say task form. We have body, but that doesn't really tell me what that really is. So we could say add a task as an alternative to the label itself. And then we can just render that on the page. See if we get an error. Tasks, task, render tasks. Let's see, I have a typo somewhere. Missing partial. Oh, it should be form, not task. And form with model, tasks path. So we need to update the form to compensate for our routing. Now here, the form helper is going to build a URL that's based off this model. And right now it's going to just assume it's just directly localhost 3000 /tasks /new. And that's not actually accurate because we have projects and then we actually will have tasks. They're nested. So if you remember in our routing, we have those nested here. So in theory, we need to build that URL in a little more granular fashion. So what we could do is add an array looking method here, pass in the instance of the project, and also the task. So what that ends up doing is creating a new URL that renders the right path for the submission action to account for. So if you see in my source code here, that builds this here automatically. That's confusing as hell at first. I didn't understand any of that when I first started, but now I get it. So that could nest, if say you nest 3 levels deep in your routes, that would just make this increase to like a third thing. I don't know, task. But that's how that works. So hopefully that's a little clearer. Okay, so with the actual form in place, it renders, but it still doesn't quite work the way we want it to. We need to actually account for a few things in the task controller that bring in the project itself, but also account for the tasks at hand. So since we have tasks relating to projects, we want to save the project itself that's associated with the tasks. So that's a boatload of words. That's probably makes no sense, but let's get to it. So maybe it makes more sense. So in here, we're actually going to set our task controller. We're actually going to set our project before each action. So we can do the same, like almost like we did in the project controller. And what I want to do is, we probably won't need the show view because we're going to render everything on the project controller side of things. We don't really need the new. I want to get rid of these comments as well. And destroy. Okay. So the index will stay the same. We'll have edit. It'll stay the same. We'll come back to create and update. Those are going to be more involved. Destroy is the same. You could change where this redirects because tasks URL doesn't really make sense. So projects, maybe something like that. And on the private methods, we're going to add another one called set project. Now you might think we do the same thing as this, but we're actually going to look for a different ID. So what we're going to say is project, and then use project class, and it'll actually be project ID. Now this is kind of confusing, but it correlates back to on the task table. We have an index and an integer of project ID on the task itself. So we're able to find a project relative to the task by using this method and find method here. So that might make sense, also might be fuzzy. That's totally fine. So while we're here, right now, if we do a creation of a new task, it's going to do the basic default kind of Rails pattern of just task.new. We're already doing that in our project show view in the folder or in the form. So what we can actually do is assign the project itself, since we have an instance of it now, and perform a create action on it. So we'll pass in the task params. And then that will be almost ready to roll. So what we want to do, notice if this does save, we're going to redirect back to the task itself. Well, we don't actually have a task show view, so that wouldn't actually work. We'd actually get an error. So what I want to do is actually go back to the project path. And we could just pass in the project instance here so we know which one to go to. And I don't think we need JSON for this, so we can go ahead and actually just get rid of those. And for new here, we don't even have that either, so we'll actually redirect back to the project path as well. So that's the creation of a task. So we basically assign the project's tasks and just go ahead and create a task instance on that object. So it's a little more involved, a little kind of more confusing, but I think as you go and practice a bit more, this makes more sense. So the update method will be one we're going to actually target with Ajax coming up. So we'll actually deal with that in a second, but for now I'm going to leave it as HTML. And we'll say redirect to project path again. And the same here. Okay, cool. So this should work at the moment. Let's go ahead and update our tasks to render on the project page once we do create them, because right now they don't. So we'll actually need to go to the show view in the project's controller and render those. So right now we have our form, but we don't have a way to render the actual tasks. So what we can do at this point is do like a UL and render. I'll just add a few classes here. So we'll say MV6, letting relaxed. And I'll just say project tasks dot each do task. And then we could just say, like, just to get something here, checkbox. This won't be final, but it's just something to show you context here. Body. So at this point we don't have any tasks, but if we were to create one, we'll have one, and it's rendering there. So good to go. Cool. So that takes care of the controller logic more or less. But we'll get to the actual Ajax stuff next. Let's focus on adding first stimulus JS to the mix. I prefer stimulus. You don't need to use stimulus. I think it does well with turbo links and Rails, and that's usually kind of a pain in the ass otherwise. So that's why I tend to use it. So why don't we go ahead and create that installation. So I'll go bundle. Webpacker install stimulus. Now this is referenced in the documentation of Webpacker as well if you want to Google that on GitHub. But this should set you up to add stimulus to your stack. And one little command. Okay, so we're set up to run that. One thing I want to do is a little cleanup. From that installation, we have now a controllers folder and some more JavaScript in our packs controller here. This came in from the stimulus installation, and then this did too. You can kind of just ignore it or pay attention to it, whatever you want to do. I'm going to rename the hello controller to, what did I name it to? Tasks controller. And we'll get rid of all this stuff for now. Keep the targets and this too. Now, if you're new to Stimulus, I have another video on kind of the basics. I might do a little more in-depth stuff coming up as something new to the channel, but we'll get to that point at some point. So instead of rendering everything in like a .each loop here, we can kind of consolidate and make it a little more friendly for us in terms of the Ajax side of things. So what I want to do is use a nice little DOM ID helper that essentially creates a ID attribute based off the class instance you're passing, and it's a unique identifier basically is the idea. So we'll just say underscore tasks, and I'll show you what that actually outputs in a second. I just want to finish here. So class, we'll add our margin bottom 6 again, letting relax. And then on here, we're going to actually initialize a controller for Stimulus. So we'll say controller tasks. Notice that correlates to the name we gave this file. So tasks controller, that's totally intended. I'm going to actually delete this line and render this. Now here we can go ahead and render a pretty complex but cool thing that Rails offers us by default, which is project.tasks. So this call here assumes you have a underscore tasks file in your task folder, just based on the naming conventions going down here. So what I'll do is create that file. It's going to be a singular version, so task underscore task.html.erb, and there we'll add the LIs. And within that will be kind of some gnarly code, but stuff that's useful for us coming up. So we'll say task ID. I should mention too that when you render this as is, it's basically passing an instance of the task variable too. So this is actually kind of shorthand for, I believe, render, let's see, tasks, task, and then it's passing in task would be task, something like that. And that's even trimmed down too. So just to give you some context there. So I'm going to output the ID for us to target the label and checkbox, and then the data action will be part of the stimulus concept, where when the input changes, we want to fire off an update call to the database. So when it is toggled complete, we want to assign it complete in the database. So we can do that by hooking into it the event change. On change, we'll go to the task controller, and then within the task controller, we'll fire this particular method, which is called toggle complete. And then I'll need access to the URL to send off this Ajax request to. So I'm going to actually append that here as well. And it will essentially be project, if I can type here, project task URL. And then we'll need to pass in both the task project and the task itself. So that builds the URL we need relative to our routing. Finally, we need a task ID, just a singular ID, so we have access to it. And then on the label, we'll have some styles that will toggle the state of, it'll be like strike through if it's complete, since we want to kind of signify that that's a thing once it's done. And I'll add that styles in a second to our CSS, so task.complete. So might be a lot to account for here. Let me finish the markup and I'll try to walk you through it a little bit more. So instead of a Rails helper, I found just a basic checkbox to be a little more easy to manhandle here. So ID is going to be task. And then we'll output the task body finally. Okay, that looks like a lot. but we'll need some of it to do what we need to do. Rendering the ID for the task for the labels, so the checkbox knows what label and what not to toggle. So on the front end, that's just basic semantic HTML markup in the end. And those are unique, hence the task IDs. It's going to be unique every time you create a new one. Now, the data attributes are all part of what we're going to need for inside this task controller to fire off some Ajax to update whether the task is completed or not. And that's going to be a field in the database called complete. Now, when it is complete, we'll add a class called complete if it is. So that's nice, handy question mark at the end of this field. And basically tells us, is this a Boolean or not? So is it true or false? So that allows us to add that. Now we need to add a little bit of CSS to make this prove worthy. So let's go back to our style sheets. I'll just go back into the forms and add a little bit more. So we'll say completed, and I'll just say apply line through italic and then opacity 50. This is all Tailwind. If you're not used to writing CSS like this, don't worry about it. It's not important, but that's just what I'm doing at the moment. Now, finally, let's get into the controller logic and get this Ajax stuff working. So if you notice in the task, we have a toggle complete method. We need to create one that's called that in this class. So toggle complete. And we won't actually even have any targets to account for here. We could do something like that, but it's not important for this. You might find you need more as you go if you're familiar with stimulus anyway. So through that event, the change event, we can actually hook into it by passing it through to this method. So what I first want to do is prevent default. And the nice thing about Webpack and whatnot is you don't need to actually add semicolons and stuff if you don't want to. So I'm going to skip those. So don't yell at me. We need to get the actual task ID to reference so the database knows what to manipulate in the end. And this will be a little tricky, but if we go into the event target, we can actually harness the data attribute on that layer. So I'll actually just type this out and then kind of show you by design. So event.target.parent element, which is going to be the label, .dataset.task ID. And then we'll have an instance of data that we'll modify in a bit. So if we were to console log, I'll just do like task ID and then task ID. Pull up our console. Wait for this to compile. It's our first time I refreshed since I installed Stimulus, so it might take a minute. So there we go. We get task ID, and it's a task ID of 1. If you look at the source of the input, it's our actual first task. So it's going to render 1 as the ID itself. So notice everything else rendering 2. We've got our class, which is empty at this point because it's not complete. We didn't update the database yet as we toggled this. So that action is part of stimulus. So once that's doing, it's firing this toggle complete call. The URL we're going to be using to do the Ajax portion as well as the ID. So basically we're ready to roll. Now the kind of confusing thing here is the way data gets passed back to Rails. It absorbs things in a different way through the parameter session in a request. So we need to formulate a string, a data string, properly to account for that. And there's probably a better method than this, but this is where I ended up. So I'm going to say if event.target.checked equals true, we're going to compensate for the URL string and return data as task. I'm going to use backticks here. ID will be equal to that task ID variable, and then we'll say and task complete, equals true. Now, if it's not the case and we unchecked it, we'll say false. So it's essentially the same thing. We just go false. And this is the way Rails can understand it through an actual data being passed through. You could probably do some sort of JSON serialization and craziness here, but I took the lazy man's route, I think. Okay, so after this, we have access to, or will have access to, a Rails object in the window element. But to do that, this might be a little far-fetched for you, but right here we're requiring Rails UI.js, but we don't have actually access to that. Like, it's just automatically being had, and you can access it in your views and controllers and whatnot. But what if we want to actually access that Rails instance? And what I've seen in the wild is this. So you can just add it to the window element and require that. And instead of starting here, you could just start it at the very end. So you could just say rails.start and just save that down. And now we have access to this class, or what I'm calling a class. And that gives us a lot of crap to work with. So if we say console.log, I'll just do it on the connect method just to show you connect. So refresh the page. This should just automatically load, and we'll get kind of insight into this object of what's going down. So the Rails object gives us a ton under the hood, and the one we're going to really focus on is this Ajax one. And through this object, we actually already have like the CRSF token if we need it, other elements, just tons of cool stuff, even relative to TurboLinks too. So lots more to talk about there, but I'll leave that alone for now. We'll just remove this bit and go back to adding that Ajax support. So what I want to do is write this bit of code. Ajax and we'll pass in an object of attributes. So the URL we need to pass through is going to be something where we need to update an attribute in the database via Ajax. So the way I'm going to do that is through our target again. And the label field, if you recall, had that URL data attribute. So this one here, data task URL. That's what we're going to hook into. So we'll say dataset.task URL. And then we're going to say type will be patch. And that essentially says in the RESTful language, that means the update method in a Rails controller, patch. And the way you could kind of signify what that looks like in a visual way is go to info routes again. If you go to the patch method, it's going to correlate to update directly. So what we'll do is fire the patch request. There's a data property. We can pass in our data, which is going to be this value here in the end. So whether it's checked or not, we'll be passing a Boolean property through, as well as the task ID. And then you can console errors or display errors if something goes wrong. We'll do that kind of in an ES6 fashion here. I'll just do a console log for now. You might want to display those to your users otherwise. And the one I want to really focus on is the success callback, which will be a response. And we'll do the same. From the response, we can say event.target. We don't really need to do anything with the response other than if it's successful, let's do something to toggle the state of the task itself. So say toggle parent element dot classless toggle completed. I think it was complete actually. I'm gonna change this to complete. I'll say completed. There we go. Got a typo there. Okay, so every time we toggle a task, this is going to fire Ajax request, which is kind of expensive, but it's also, nice to have because you don't need to actually update the page and see things happen in real time. Now at this point, nothing here is going to actually work. We're going to get an Ajax request, but nothing's going to actually happen in the database layer because we don't have it doing anything in the controller. So what we need to do is go to the tasks controller to accommodate. So on the update method itself is where we're going to pay most attention. And what I'll do is actually make a new instance of tasks because it's going to make more sense. So project.tasks.find params task ID. And this is going to be relative to that request. So if you recall in the data strings here, we're going to have task ID and then this completed attribute. So we're going to actually hook into those things in this case. In this particular case, we're finding the task itself so we can use it to manipulate. So first, below the respond to do block, I'll say if params task complete equals true. We'll just say task.update complete true. So basically that's saying if this request comes back and this is actually true in the data of the Ajax payload, we'll go ahead and update that attribute to be true in the backend. So I think this should work at this point. One thing we might need to do, no, that should be good. Let's see if we can check our work here. We got an issue. Task URL. Data, I think data is wrong. Data set. Refresh. There we go. Task successfully updated. Notice it's kind of, jumpy. It's displaying stuff. That's all basically because the response is HTML. We kind of need to change that to be more of a JSON delivery, even though we don't necessarily need it to be. So what I want to do instead of this update action here, I'm going to update it to be JSON. And we'll just say render show. Status. Okay. Location. Project path. Project. And now when we go to do that again, I'll uncheck it. Looks like I have issue. Okay. I got this error in the beginning, and because it's a JSON response, it's actually looking in our scaffold for the JSON JBuilder file. And one thing we need to do is update a bit in that file just to make this not bark at us. In particular, we're going to have project task URL, and we'll need to render task.project back, and that should do the trick, I think. So complete, good to go. If we go to our patch request here, we see it's a patch. There's a payload. The response is complete true. Project ID is 1. So it seems to be working. And that's what's going through. Pretty cool stuff. So notice the styles it took on too. If I refresh the page, it stays in that state. So everything's working swimmingly. Now there's some more work to be done in terms of getting our projects and users correlating. So we'll do that in the very next episode. Hello Rails is my new course on Ruby on Rails. I'll teach you Ruby on Rails from the ground up. Visit hellorails.io for more information.